My name is Hilary Swain, and I'm the director here at Archbold. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Archbold. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to tell you where you're going to go on your virtual field trip. I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to Archbold so you know a little bit about us before we head out into the field. Obviously, welcome to all of you. And then after I've done that, I'm going to introduce the panelists who will be featuring in the videos and also able to answer any of your questions. And we'll describe to you how we're going to run this field trip. So our field trip today is about Archbold, but we're going to focus on fire. And I'm going to share my screen and, okay, when I'm allowed to. Yeah. And could someone tell me that they can see that, Laura? Yeah.
Yes.
Very good, thanks. So Archbold Biological Station lies in central Florida in an area that's often known as the headwaters of the Everglades. So here we are in Florida, the lands and waters that flow south into Lake Okeechobee, and from there south into the Everglades and east and west to the coast. And Archbold Biological Station manages 20,000 acres in this 2.6 million acre watershed. We have two major properties, one on an ancient sand ridge, the Lake Wales Ridge that runs through the west side of this headwaters. It's an ancient Florida scrub sand dune system. And our other major property is known as Buck Island Ranch, and it lies within this watershed and is one of the working cattle ranches that are a predominant feature of this watershed. The green, for your information, are conservation lands in the area, and the little red dots are all the locations where Archbold conducts work. So we work on our two main properties and throughout the watershed. Your field trip today is going to be both to the station and to our Buck Island Ranch. Our mission is to build and share knowledge, research and education, to protect the life, lands and waters, the conservation part of our mission, of the heart of Florida and beyond. And we often like to say we work from ridge to ranch to river. This is the large Kissimmee River that runs through this watershed. If you come to Archbold and you joined us for a real field trip, this is probably where you'd start. You'd come down our drive, you'd find a campus of sort of historic buildings that are our main research hub, and a very large welcome center with public education, K through 12, and accommodation for visitors in this facility and around. And you can see it's, if you're heading for a field trip here, it's only a hop, skip and a jump and you're in the field. So that's a little bit of an introduction to Archbold. The big things we work on is biodiversity and the natural processes, carbon, water, nutrients, fire that support biodiversity. This is one of the world's, and you'll hear about that, it's one of the world's most endangered ecosystems where we work. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to ask all the panelists if they could quickly put on their videos, and we'll do some very quick introductions. And I'm going to just go around the way I can see them. Just name and which program you work with. So Reed Bowman.
I'm Reed Bowman. I'm the director of the Avian Ecology program at Archbold.
Thank you. Scott Ward, and then it'll be Dustin.
My name is Scott Ward. I'm a research assistant in the plant ecology program.
Great.
Dustin Angel, Director of Education.
Betsy Rothermel, and then Greg Saunier.
Betsy Rothermel, I'm the Director of the Restoration Ecology and Herpetology Research Program. Oh.
Greg, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Gregory Saunier. I'm an assistant research biologist working at Buck Island Ranch.
Thank you. And then Betsy Boughton and Amanda West.
Hi, everybody. I'm Betsy Boughton, and I'm the Program Director of Agroecology at Archbold.
Hi, I'm Amanda West, and I'm a research assistant with the Restoration Ecology and Herpetology program.
So just to make this a little bit easier on you, we're going to do some short film sections, each featuring different people that you can see on the screen. And then we're going to have short questions, particular details about those segments. And then at the end, we'll have a broader discussion where you can ask questions of all of us. And the recurring theme is fire, but it's okay if you want to verge into other areas to ask other questions. That would be fine too. And our first question is going to be a video entitled Surviving Fire, which is actually by a professional videographer who works with us, Jen Brown. The next two videos are by Dustin using his cell phone. So he wanted you to know that these are, the second two are cell phone productions. So I think straight over to you, Laura, and if we can run the Surviving Fire.
Fire is one of the Earth's dominant forces. Fire shapes the ecology of Earth, and it is in the world of plants where fire transforms the Earth. Plants are the fuel for fire. Tucked inside the Florida Peninsula are fire-loving prairies, pinelands, and scrublands. You might be surprised that fire is so important in Florida, where we have such heavy summer rains and high humidity. These plants are adapted to floods, fire, droughts, hurricane winds, and even frost. With all the disturbances thrown at life in Florida, none is more important than fire. When fire is suppressed, the low and open scrub that so many rare plants and animals depend upon can become a forest. It turns out that the lack of fire is a bigger disturbance than fire. For 3 decades, I've been studying how plants of the Florida scrub respond to fire. When I was very young, I became fascinated by nature and plants. My dad took me on hikes, and my grandfather, who was a professor and a botanist, would teach me plants in the fields and forests of Maine. They had great curiosity about nature. They just wanted to figure out how nature worked, and that was really inspiring. 30 years ago, my wife and our 3 cats and I began a long car trip from Indiana to South Central Florida here in the Lake Wales Ridge, where I began working for Archbold Biological Station, studying plants and fire in places like this. These ancient sand dunes support an incredible number of rare plants that occur nowhere else on Earth. Besides these special plants, I was struck by the patterns in the Florida scrub. With an elevation change of just a few feet, I could walk from the open dry sand of rosemary scrub downhill through oaks and palmettos and into the mucky, grassy seasonal ponds. I became a giant, traversing hilly terrain in just a few steps. I'll never forget my first prescribed burn here in 1989. I followed the burn boss, Jeff Babb, of the Nature Conservancy around like a little puppy. The fire intensity would vary from meter to meter and from minute to minute. Some burned areas were all black. In other places, the fire had been more delicate, leaving wilted leaves still attached to branches. How do plants recover from the black ash, from what looks like nothing? To understand how scrub plants survive, I listened to them over many generations. Under the sun, in the rain, along with scores of curious interns and outstanding research assistants. 924 arnica is a vegetative plant with 1 rosette, and it's 2.9. After a fire in Archbold's second largest patch of rosemary scrub in 1985, all the rosemary died. Then, after 2 years, just a handful of rosemary seedlings emerged from seeds stored in the soil. I became concerned. Florida rosemary is a foundation species on these high and dry patches of rosemary scrub. Losing rosemary from this area would have been a major change. I systematically followed individual rosemary plants for decades after the fire, as I do for many rare and imperiled plants here. I discovered tiny rosemary seedlings had really high survival after fire. Over 95% of them survived every year. So a few of these seedlings could become another Florida rosemary stand. Rosemary needs 5 to 10 years to reach flowering maturity, to produce fruits, and to replenish the seed bank. If rosemary is burned before maturity, then there will be fewer seeds to trickle down into the soil for safekeeping. I shared my findings with other land managers to help better protect the scattered rosemary stands that still remained. Florida rosemary depends on its offspring, its seeds, to keep their genes living. We call it a reseeder. Lots of plants use this strategy. Like Florida rosemary, the sandpine dies during a fire. Killed by fire, and these cones. Sandpine never invested in or evolved any physical fire defenses. Just look at it. Its evergreen branches spread out from bottom to top. Fire climbs up the short needle branches like a stepladder, burning each step as it goes. The thin bark of the sandpine offers little resistance to fire. Yet, the sandpine strategy works, thanks to these. Sandpine cones open up and drop seeds in response to heat or just old age. Fate and fortune ensure that some seeds survive. Sandpine seedlings germinate within a few months of fire, nurtured by greater sunlight, soil moisture, and nutrients from the ashes of their parent. The other pine in the Florida scrub takes a different approach. The South Florida slash pine puts up a fight and chooses not to die in the first place. Look at these long fire-deflecting pine needles and shaggy layers of fire-resistant bark. Notice the lack of lower limbs so fire can't climb up into the canopy. Ironically, slash pine adults can die when burned too little. Too little fire lets the understory build up into a tinderbox, fueling hotter and larger fires. None of these rare and delicate-looking scrub plants can survive fire. Something else survives that is invisible to us. Seeds. Lots of them. Depositing precious seeds into the seed bank is like saving for a rainy day, or, in this case, a burn day. Fire might kill seeds in the top layers of soil, but deeper seeds survive. We discovered that rare plants, like wedge-leaf button snakeroot, store seeds for years and even decades in the soil. Then, right after the fire, the population explodes with lots of seedlings. But the longer these plants go without fire, the more the populations decline. Number 119 is dead. Their soil seed banks get depleted. This boom and bust cycle creates distinct patterns for reseeder plants in response to fire.
So I was going to invite Scott and Amanda to join me with answering any questions, but everybody else feel free to chip in and answer any questions. So first thing is, there's lots of extra information in the chat if you want to look at the full videos or explore more work about Archbold. But if you have any questions for us, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll pose them to our different participants. I know things are often a bit slow to start up, but maybe I could pose a question. How as a visiting researcher to Archbold, go ahead and put your videos on if you want. As a visiting researcher to Archbold, what are some of the ways that you can use fire to actually conduct research? How can we offer fire as a facility? I don't know whether Amanda, you wanted to talk to that, or anybody else wanted to chip in.
I can say that Archbold has an amazing record of fire on our landscape, and our land manager, Kevin Main, does a really good job of recording that. So a lot of our researchers love using fire return interval and time since recent fire. And we have multiple areas across landscapes, so you can do a bunch of areas and different plots and look at the effect of fire on your question.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Well, I think we're often, I mean, at least where a lot of our plots are located, we're sort of subject to just the randomness of fires. And we hope that in some cases it's patchy enough so we can get, you know, the variable of burned and unburned and really compare how some of these species respond. So I think a lot of times it's kind of opportunistic, and in some cases it would be really neat to say, oh, I wish we could just maybe put fire in these areas and then compare it to similar areas. But fortunately we have these adjacent units that, you know, are burned and unburned and often have pretty different fire return intervals. So we can compare things often, you know, right next to each other.
Also, the beauty of having a relatively large property with a fire management plan that we've been implementing for over 20 years allows you to look at the effects of fire at a variety of different scales. All the different fires that we've done over the years create a mosaic of different fire times, but there's patchiness even within a fire. So you can look at the scale and impacts of fire at a variety of different scales, which means that we can look at it at the community level as well.
So I would just like to add a little scaling for there at Archbold at the station and our adjacent property, which is called the Reserve. We have about 200 burn units to give you some idea of the scale. It's nearly 10,000, you know, 9,500 acres, 200 burn units, some of which are, you know, sort of a couple of hundred acres, a few of which are smaller. So it gives you an idea of the mosaic of fire management that we undertake on an annual basis. Betsy or Dustin, did you want to add anything, or should we move on to the next
my
video?
stopwatch is telling me it's time to move on.
Okay,
so
go.
I was just going to announce to everybody. So we wanted you to have kind of a feel of a field trip. So our crew here went out to an area that burned recently and just kind of walked around and looked at stuff. And I filmed them with a cell phone. So that's our next 8 or 9 minute video. So we can, Laura, you can launch that.
Hi ESA field trippers, welcome to Archbold Biological Station. So we're all standing out in a fairly recent burn. This was not a planned burn, it was not a prescription burn, nor was it really truly a real natural wildfire, but it was started by a train. But nonetheless, it burned about 250 acres, but in a property that's a little over 10,000 acres. So, you know, at one sense it seems like a lot, but at another sense it's sort of a small portion of the whole. And we're out here to just sort of look at the patterns of this fire. You know, how patchy was it? Are there unburned areas within this unit? And how has the vegetation and the animals responded to the fire? So here's a Florida scrub jay, one of the birds we study. Interestingly, even though this particular pair, their territory was completely burned in this fire, it was just patchy enough that they've been able to hang on and not get displaced by this fire. Now, if they were displaced, they wouldn't move very far. All they'd do is start fighting with their neighbor whose territory didn't burn and try and steal just a wee little bit of green stuff. Fire is that sort of yin-yang thing in that it can have really negative short-term consequences, but it's absolutely essential for the long-term persistence of these fire-adapted species. You know, all our jays, a lot of our jays, not all of them, are tagged right now. And we have 129 receivers distributed through the habitat. and then all the data from the receivers comes here, and then this actually uploads it to the cloud, and we can look at how the birds are moving. This is the remnants of post-fire technology. So this, all in all, between the number of receivers we lost and the sensor station, we've lost a lot of potential data, but we actually collected a lot of data during the fire, and the system's a little bit redundant, so there's overlapping. So we have another sensor station that might have picked up what some of the birds were doing after the fire. But what this allows us to do is to look at how jays move during a fire. Do they just get out of the way, or are they able to just fly very far, or do they stay right on the edge?
So here we have Dicerandra frutescens. This is a mint. It grows exclusively in Highlands County, Florida. It's one of 5 vascular plants that only is found in Highlands County. And my mentor and boss, Eric Menges, who just retired this week actually after about 33 years or so of demographic research at Archbold, has been studying this since he first was hired here in 1988, along with a couple other species as well. But what he's been able to find over the years after closely monitoring various subpopulations is that this species, as well as Eryngium cuneiform, populations seem to peak about 6 to 10 years after fire and then slowly decline after that. So his research and collaboration with other researchers and demographers has helped to really show how important frequent fire is for some of these rare species.
At Archbold, we have a long-term study on our gopher tortoise population that started in 1967 with Jim Lane. And Dr. Betsy Rothemel has continued that study on and has found a lot of very interesting things about restoration effects on gopher tortoises. And currently we're looking at juvenile survivorship and also growth in response to the food that's available to the tortoises. This is a gopher tortoise burrow, and I'm scoping it to see if there's a tortoise in it, which is a little camera on the end of this rope. These burrows are very important during a fire, as you can imagine, that it's a refugia when the flames pass over. So it increases tortoise survivorship and also the survivorship of the numerous commensals that use these burrows, such as indigo snakes, gopher frogs, mice, rabbits, and a ton of invertebrates that can use this burrow to survive the flame and then come out and utilize the habitat.
So after fire, as plant ecologists, we're mostly interested in how plants respond. What survivorship is, reproduction. Obviously here we can see a lot of resprouters, kind of low palms, low oaks, some ericaceous species, and then kind of some random things too. This is Nolina britoniana, Britain's beargrass. This is a Lake Wales Ridge endemic, and as you can see, a couple months after fire, it's resprouted quite vigorously. So this species has really high survivorship, almost like 98 or 99% after fire. So, as a plant ecologist or botanist, what you first appreciate about the Lake Wales Ridge is just how uniquely different it is than the rest of the southeast. Ecosystems or habitats start and stop abruptly within, just a 1 footstep. I'm basically, like in a different habitat. So
it's very based on the groundwater, as opposed to other ecosystems that can hold moisture from either subsurface flow or rain. We are 100% almost based on the groundwater level. So as soon as you raise 6 inches,
you're out of it, yeah.
Yeah, the plant system changes because of their adaptability to dry soils. Oh, look at this guy.
Sweet.
He's got little leg buds.
I've been wanting to see one of these for a long time. I gotta get some pics of this guy.
We often find them in ditches buried in the deep muds. But how fantastic. This is not a species that people expect to find in a dry, sandy ecosystem. Well, it's just wonderful to be here at Archbold in a wetland, and I know many of you watching might be a bit surprised to see this type of seasonal wetland in what most people think of as a fire-driven ecosystem. But in the scrub, we have hundreds of these seasonal wetlands. We go back decades in terms of data collection. So one of the extraordinary things for visitors at Archbold and for early career scientists and for our regular scientists is we have this incredible long-term database of fire in the terrestrial system, sometimes sweeping across wetlands, and then the hydrology of the wetlands, water level, and also the level in the groundwater in the sand. And it's actually those two things together, the synergy of fire and water, that is a big driver here. And we increasingly are understanding the role of hydrology in the big picture of the Florida scrub, as well as the dominant role of fire. And it's a privilege to be able to offer that as a research opportunity. You can come here as a researcher from around the world, and you can stand in this wetland and you can know its fire history going back to 1969 and its hydrology going back to probably 1989. And you'll also know the rainfall patterns going back to 1932. So that begins, that legacy on the landscape is an extraordinary resource for researchers. Here you can come, and space and long-term data help you design experiments and collect data that is really deep and meaningful. Okay. So just invite any of the panelists to join me here, and we have a question in the chat, two questions. So I'm going to ask this question first. I see Scott's already quickly answering it. So Scott, the question was, are there any plant and animal species that are only found at Archbold? And maybe we could expand that to only found on the Lake Wales Ridge as well. And Scott is our, great and enthusiastic botanist. So why don't you take a lead on that one, Scott?
Yeah, the two that really stand out are Dicerandra frutescens and Rhingium cuneiform. They're not exclusive to Archbold, but they're definitely not found much further than kind of northern Highlands County. We have a fair amount of their populations, especially Dicerandra frutescens. And so a lot of the demographic research at Archbold is not only convenient, but actually really essential to understanding these species because they have such a limited global distribution. And I know there's some invertebrates that are probably a little bit more limited at the southern Lake Wales Ridge as well. As for, some mammal species and birds, I can't really expand on that much, but yeah, so there's definitely a couple plants and insects I know that are pretty exclusive.
Yeah. Betsy, do you want to do the herps?
Well, we have our Florida scrub lizard, which is pretty much restricted to the Lake Wales Ridge. So a species of Scoloporus, if you're familiar with those lizards. Trying to think, there's not a lot of others that are really restricted. Well, there's sand skinks, Florida sand skink, another virtually legless lizard that swims in the sand. Other than that, we just have some sort of genetically distinct populations of some things on the southern part of the Lake Wales Ridge, like little crown snakes and things.
So Reed introduced you to the Florida scrub jay. I think what's distinctive about it at Archbold is the well-studied population, going back decades. So do you want to add anything to that, Reed, or?
Well, scrub jays are restricted to oak scrub, but it takes all shapes and forms, partly because of different fire histories for those scrubs. It's not restricted to Archbold, it's not even restricted to the Lake Wales Ridge, but it is restricted to these high, dry, sandy ridges that support scrub throughout peninsular Florida.
So I know Dustin is going to be breathing down my neck at the minute, saying we have to move on to the next video. There was a really great question from Bob Holt, and Bob, I'd like to give a broader answer to that at the end when we have all of us together and we've seen all the videos. That's the one of notable and or worrying signs of climate change at Archbold. We also didn't answer the question of, endemic Archbold restricted bugs, so I can make some comments on that if we have a bit of time at the end. So why don't we move on to the last video, and we're going to take a change of pace. We're going to join Betsy Boughton and Greg Saunier down at Buck Island Ranch, which is our working cattle ranch, full-scale working cattle ranch, and we're going to hear about fire on a working ranch. So thank you.
I'm Dr. Betsy Boughton. I'm the program director of agroecology, and I'm really excited to show you around Buck Island Ranch today on our virtual field trip. So today we're going to talk about one of our experiments to look at different fire regimes on a ranch, and the idea is to mimic the natural fire and grazing interaction that can occur, and to use that to create heterogeneity in grasslands. So when a place is recently burned, that attracts cattle to graze there, and you can create shorter vegetation. And while in ungrazed or unburned areas, cattle ignore those areas, so you end up with tall vegetation. And so if you can create different patches with different time sense disturbances in the pasture, that benefits biodiversity and can affect ecosystem functions. And this has been studied in the Great Plains in Oklahoma and Texas. The land management term to mimic that grazing and fire interaction is called patch burn grazing. And so we wanted to try it here in subtropical grasslands because it hasn't been utilized as much or tested, and we wanted to understand if we could use that disturbance regime in tropical areas to create heterogeneity. So on our way here, we drove through Bahia grass pastures. These are called improved pastures, which are planted with non-native grasses, and they're fertilized, and they have higher cattle stocking density. And now we're standing in what we call a semi-native pasture. And this pasture type is dominated by native plant species. There are some non-native forage species mixed in. It's never been fertilized, and it has some ditches to alter hydrology. We are in Florida's prairie region in central Florida, where natural cycles of fire and flooding maintained these open treeless landscapes of wet and dry prairie and seasonal wetlands. We have a distinct dry and wet season in Florida, and typically when fires would occur naturally was in that transition period from dry to wet season, when lightning strikes started and they would ignite dry vegetation. Florida ranchers also use prescribed fire extensively, and even in times when fire suppression policies were popular, Florida ranchers kept burning. And this is sort of a win-win for cattle production and biodiversity, because fire maintains the vegetation, grassland vegetation, and also improves forage quality. So you see higher protein in vegetation that's recently burned, and that's a benefit to cattle. But we also know that vegetation is adapted to frequent fire. And so this is really important for native plants that are adapted to fire and actually need fire to stimulate flowering and fruit production. And so the area I'm standing in was recently burned. It was burned in February, and we did a patch burn. So our experimental units are 40-acre pastures, and when we say we did a patch burn, it means we burned 1/3 of the pasture, so about 13 acres. And we're comparing that to a pasture that was completely burned. Every 3 years we'd do a full burn, compared to a patch burn system where we burn 1/3 of the pasture every year, a different third. And our expectation is that the patch burn will create different vegetation heights and different diversities that are occurring in these different thirds of the pasture, and that would benefit higher trophic levels like grassland birds. And we have tons of meadowlarks here at Buck Island Ranch. And the other, we did expect it also to affect ecosystem function, like the carbon capture of the ecosystem. So we worked with our collaborators at University of Illinois and Cornell and USDA to look at the ecosystem function aspects of these different fire regimes. So we've installed eddy covariance towers to understand the carbon cycle in these grasslands, and we're measuring both carbon dioxide and methane, which are two important greenhouse gases that come from the ecosystems and also are absorbed by the ecosystem. And we have some preliminary findings that suggest that although fire releases a huge carbon release, you know, you see that big plume of smoke, that's carbon released when you burn an ecosystem, that because fire increases the productivity, we actually see an uptake of increased uptake that recovers all of the carbon lost in the fire, and actually fire becomes neutral or positive on the carbon uptake of the ecosystem. And this is typical for Florida ecosystems. In our study, we found that fire reduces ecosystem respiration. So that's what the CO2 that we see coming from the soil and plants is reduced in recently burned areas. And so patch burn grazing, our preliminary studies suggest that patch burn grazing management increases the carbon capture of these semi-native grasslands.
Hello everyone, my name is Gregory Saunier. I'm an assistant research biologist working at Buck Island Ranch. I am a plant community ecologist by training, and I've been involved in all the vegetation survey that started in 2016 as part of this patch burn versus full burn experiment. As Betsy mentioned earlier, we're sitting here in the most recent burn patch. It was burned about 4 months ago, and you can see the vegetation is still relatively short. And we've been surveying this vegetation every year since 2016, and we look at a couple of different diversity metrics, including, of course, native species richness, exotic species richness. And one of the key results we observed in this experiment is that native species richness increased following fire, and that overall in the patch burn grazing treatment have higher native species diversity than the full burn treatment. Here we're sitting in a sector that was burned 2 years ago, and as you can see, the vegetation here is obviously quite higher than what we observed initially. And that's one of the key results of this experiment, is that the vegetation structure heterogeneity increase in patch burn grazing treatment versus full burn, which could be important for grassland burn.
Another thing we did was we put GPS collars on cows to see how they change their behavior in response to the patch burn grazing treatment. And we found that, as expected, cattle were attracted to graze on recently burned areas. And this response lasted for the entire year. So even though we would use rotational grazing and move cows in and out of the pasture, every time they came into the patch burn pastures, they would graze primarily on the recently burned patch. In contrast, in the full burn patches, the cattle used all 3 sections of the pasture equally. And so this was really interesting because this is a phenomenon that has been found in grazing lands all over the world, that cattle are attracted to graze in recently burned areas. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us on this virtual field trip. We've really enjoyed showing you around Buck Island Ranch. I'd like to say thank you to our funding sources, especially USDA, LTAR, and the National Institute of Food and Agriculture for funding the patch burn grazing project, and to all our other partners and collaborators that have supported Buck Island Ranch research.
And we hope to see you in person at the next ESA meeting.
Thank you. So Betsy and Greg, and of course anyone else who would like to join us, let's see if there were any particular questions about this, about the fire on Buck Island Ranch, and then if not, we'll go further into opening it and just general questions about Archbold and fire in general, and go back to the climate change question. So I don't actually see, I don't see any questions. Nobody seems to be itching to know more about Buck Island Ranch. So maybe I'll ask you both a question. One of the things that people are always asking us is, you know, that cattle should be removed from grasslands, and that we often hear, you know, that fire is a far better management tool for the grasslands. What's your observation on the synergy between fire or grazing, or, you know, where is it? You know, what are what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the two or both approaches? Go ahead, Betsy. Oh, Greg.
I thought Greg might want to take that one.
I think one of the big
that is a really good question, Hillary, and I think it's a, you know, it's a very complex issue. The thing that I have observed on the ranch, in the wetlands and the prairies that I work in, is that our grazing management follows best management practices, and we use rotational grazing, and we're very careful about moving cattle out of pastures when we see certain indicators, and we use plant heights. I know our ranch managers use plant heights for indicators of moving cattle out. So I think, you know, low intensity grazing is a disturbance, and it removes biomass, and it can be compatible in these really productive ecosystems that recover very quickly after disturbance. And a lot of our plants are resprouters, and they are adapted to fire, and so they're used to having their above ground biomass removed, and cattle kind of mimic that in a way. I do think the combination of grazing and fire is a management tool that we can harness to try to create heterogeneity.
Did you want to add?
I see a question. I see a
what
question.
I could add to what Betsy just said is that cattle are, like, compared to fire, which will burn pretty much everything on our grassland. Cattle are more picky, so which could create some different patterns of disturbance, just because they're more, it's a picky animal, and it could be selective in what it actually eats.
So I'm going to throw the other question back to Betsy. Push yourself back, you know, to the 11,000 years ago, and the question of whether, you know, there were obviously mega herbivores in Florida. We've lost most of the large ones. Can cattle be managed to provide proxies of that historic herbivory and disturbance regime?
You guys are asking some tough questions. No, I think there's been studies of comparisons of bison and cattle in the Great Plains, and I know there's some differences. For example, cattle tend to go into wet areas and wetlands more, and bison and other animals that were adapted to drier conditions don't do that as much. So one of the best management practices that we use is putting alternative water sources in our pastures. So we put in water troughs, and cattle definitely select to go to the water trough if one is available rather than going into wetlands. So we are careful and cognizant that there could be negative impacts of cattle if there's too many cattle loafing in wetland areas. And you know, we have feral hogs on the ranch, and one thing I have heard is that the feral hogs that wallow and go into wetlands and disturb vegetation and create this rooting disturbance, that may actually be a proxy for some of those mega herbivores that created soil disturbance in the past. But I don't know. kind of speculating a lot.
I think I would add one thing to this, and then we'll move on to the climate change question, is the question of scale. So we can imagine that mega herbivores would have moved across that landscape in enormous herds, or likely did. Maybe not all of them, maybe some were browsers, but so obviously ranches are very large. I mean, the neighboring ranches around us are, one's 350,000 acres. We have a neighbor that's 64,000 acres. These are large ranches. But, with modern fencing and cattle movement, we are never replicating the huge herds that could have been expected to move across Florida. However, we are much closer to that than small, units of pastures that you might find in northern temperate areas where there are very, very small fields. So Florida has that sort of somewhat savanna feeling. I can't tell you how many people come to Buck Island Ranch and say, oh, I feel like I'm out in the savanna, because you have these endless vistas and large herbivores on them, but clearly not mimicking that level of scale, neither for grazing nor for fire, which probably swept over, vast hundreds of thousands of acres in extreme conditions, which it does no longer do. I'm going
something to this, Hillary.
Sure, please.
Yeah, just when you mentioned like using those large pastures, it reminded me of Blue Head Cattle Ranch, which they use flash grazing, try to mimic those large movements that could have been present in Florida. And they use the whole herd and they move it like pretty quickly across their bigger ranch with larger pastures than ours.
Yeah, that's an unusual ranch. So it's a moving herd of 1,000 animals, maybe for 2 to 3 to 4 days into one pasture, and then moving on to another pasture to mimic that scale, which is an interesting approach. Okay, would everyone else like to put on their videos? And please encourage any of you listeners still hanging in there. Give us some more difficult questions, but maybe we could open up the perennial one, which is the climate change question. What are we seeing in terms of climate change at Archbold? How worrying is it? You're probably not going to like this answer because it's a very complex story, but and clearly we're very focused on carbon work. So Betsy, Boughton, did you want to start off on what we're doing in terms of understanding greenhouse gas emissions and carbon work at the ranch? And then we could talk a little bit more with the others on responses to climate change.
Yeah, so we are very cognizant that agricultural activities can be a source of greenhouse gases, and that in the future we want to mitigate that, or starting right now. And we first started out looking at, we have this big question: are we a carbon source or sink at the ranch? And we started that with UF. And we looked at all our operational data to look at our emissions. And we calculated that, oh God, Hillary, my brain is dying. Yeah, we have like 11 metric tons of carbon released from the operations alone. That's the cattle. The cattle are about 84% of that, because they release from their enteric fermentation digestion processes. And that includes tractor use, gas use, fires, fertilizer, all of our emissions. And then we wanted to look at the other side of that. That's what are we taking up with the ecosystem? And we have 10,500 acres and 600 wetlands on those acres. And we have woodlands and grasslands. And so we did a back of the envelope calculation using some published data on carbon's data from those ecosystems. And we calculated about 17 metric tons. So it kind of like at the beginning, when we started to look at that, it looked like we were a net sink. But we knew we had some missing data from that. And so we wanted to really understand the methane release from our ecosystems, because we do have wet soils and we have 600 wetlands. And so in the wet season, we're potentially releasing a lot of methane from our soils alone. And that wasn't included in that initial calculation. And we also are missing data on nitrous oxide. So we started to work with University of Illinois and Cornell and USDA, and we installed 5 eddy covariance towers on the ranch. And we've been collecting data since 2013. So some of our biggest results are, one, looking at the methane, the ecosystem methane versus the cattle methane. The cows are only about 30 or 19 to 30% of our methane budget on the ranch, which was surprising. Most of it is from the wet soils. And then the other, one of the other big studies took place in semi-native pastures, and we compared grazed and ungrazed grasslands, and we found that grazed systems were actually taking up more carbon than ungrazed. And that's even after accounting for cattle methane and cattle grazing and increasing soil wetness in grazed systems. And that was due to the removal of biomass that increased greenness of the pasture. And when you have green leaves, that's taking up carbon. So we're still working on understanding if we're a source or a sink. Right now, we're looking at adding nitrous oxide and how much nitrous oxide that do we have coming from our ecosystems. And we're still, we still need to get the landscape picture of how to improve pastures, what are improved pastures doing, what are semi-native and what are wetlands. And it's complex because of our rainfall patterns that change every year and our fire regimes. And we're still putting it all together and hoping to get more detailed of a picture in a couple of years, maybe.
So what Betsy has just done is what everybody who comes to Archbold, they ask a simple question and the answer is always deeply complex and involves lots of data. Thank you, Betsy. I'm just going to give the one or two sentence description on the downscaling models, what we anticipate, but I'd like to ask Betsy or Reed or the others to chip in with thoughts you've had from your own, the work you're doing with the Gopher Tortoise, the team that are looking at the climate change effects on the Red Hill, for example. So bottom line, Peninsula Florida, very, very difficult to model because of the peninsular effect. Second thing is we're in one of the most unpredictable areas of Florida. So Central Florida seems to be the clearest thing is we are the most unpredictable area to predict change over time. Our temperature data, strangely enough, we've actually been getting slightly colder winters, probably as a result of vast drainage of this areas during the 30s and 40s and 50s. So we have more freeze days and colder minimum temperatures in December, January, and February, and some indication of slightly hotter August. This is not to say that there are other areas like in coastal Florida and in metropolitan areas that haven't heated up a lot, but rural Central Florida has actually there's some phenology and other data suggesting that we've actually been getting cooler in the winters. Our rainfall, general predictions, and we have some new tests coming up on the ranch for that. General predictions are, we expect the downscaling predictions are for for wetter, dry seasons, that's in our winter, for slightly drier, wet seasons, that's in our summer, and for wet seasons to start later, and for all rain events to be more intense. However, those predictions are extremely uncertain, and we have a new drought out experiment on the ranch to test the responses of grasslands to these extremes of those weather predictions. I know Betsy and Reed have had a little bit of work on climate change, but there's always the challenge in Florida that there's always other things interacting, land use change, people's behavior that is interacting on top of it. So Reed or Betsy, did you want to add anything?
Well, we've often put climate variables into a variety of different models. One climate variable that seems to stand out as being fairly influential on a variety of parameters in scrub-day demography is the Southern Oscillation Index.
Yeah.
It has big effects on juvenile survival, timing of breeding, and although it wasn't specifically Southern Oscillation Index, but the pattern of spring droughts has had a big effect on annual acorn production. And in fact, we've got a paper coming out in Royal Society, Proceedings of the Royal Society B, that shows that that our acorn production is significantly declining. And one of the strongest correlates is the increased frequency and duration of droughts. So, and that of course is a very important resource for the jays. So that could have some effects, but again, this is really sort of preliminary information.
Yeah, thank you, Reed. Did you want to add anything, Betsy Rothermel, or are you good on this?
I guess I could just mention that where it's come up on the herpetology side of what we do is with gopher tortoises being an ectothermic species with temperature-dependent sex determination. So just like sea turtles, there is concern about skewed sex ratios with warmer temperatures, which in the case of gopher tortoises could mean actually female biased sex ratios of hatchlings. And we've had a group from Georgia Southern University that's been working here. And we actually hit a snag trying to come up with hormonal approaches to sexing the hatchlings. So we've had to kind of back up and look at just temperature effects on hatching success itself. And we are finding some effects of temperature on hatching success, but it's going to be mediated by female behaviors like nesting depth too. But that's kind of cool because it suggests that there could be selection on things like nesting behavior, or it's a plastic.
Okay. So I'm watching our time. I think we've got a minute or two. So I did want to take an opportunity to wrap up. For those of you who have stuck with us through the field trip, I'd want to really thank you for doing that. Encourage you as things slowly will open up. We are taking visiting researchers at Archbold. We're always interested in people visiting here. We've managed to have visiting researchers in college classes, even though we haven't haven't been open to the public. I wanted to also thank all of the participants, and particularly to Dustin for getting all the cell videos together. We've actually been recording this, so hopefully we can use it for visiting college classes or other people who are thinking of coming, so they can learn a little bit about fire across the Archbold ecosystem. And I did want to end on one little note, and that is on the climate change. You know, Archbold is like many other field stations. For us, our very survival is threatened not only by climate change and, you know, our ability to offer an ecological field destination over the decades is going to be highly driven by land use change and land development. The threat from that is overwhelming and an immediate and pressing concern for us. So, you know, retreat from the coast because of sea level rise, which is clearly a big factor, you know, the massive movement of people to Florida. You know, we are fighting very, very hard to keep this ecosystem and all of our surrounding lands and the processes such as fire that maintain this as a great virtual site. There is an enormous focus at Archbold in putting our science into conservation action because we're a special place in a special ecosystem, and we're under enormous threat. So thank you very much. And I think just everyone cheer the audience and cheer ourselves. I appreciate it very much. And we're going to check out now. I like the words. Thank you for sharing. Archbold seems like a very special place. It is. Thank you all very much. Okay, bye.